Okay.
Mrs. Secretary.
Yep.
Yep.
Dr. Mahoney,
Here.
Mr. Pepcorn,
Here.
Mr. Grinberg,
Here.
Mr. Judd, Mr. Hendrickson, Ms. Carlson,
Present.
Mrs. Sherling, Mr. Peterson,
I'm here.
Mr. Steen, Mr. Campbell,
Here.
Mr. Wayland,
Here.
Mr. Thorsted,
Here.
Mr. Olson.
Here.
Is there anyone who's here that did not respond initially? Okay, it looks like there is a quorum.
Good. Well, then we can get started. I'll call the meeting to order. We have minutes from the previous meeting, Joel. Are those up, or do you need to approve the minutes from the previous meeting?
Those were on the agenda, yes. So we should approve the minutes from the previous meeting.
Do you have a motion?
Move to approve.
Motion to approve,
Move to approve grant.
Second, Chad.
Chad. All those in favor say aye.
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 Maybe it could do Mary Shirley's. All those not in favor say no, but okay. And approve the order of the agenda. I would assume, since we only have one item here, Joel, there shouldn't be any confusion. We probably could just go ahead. So do you want to go to your educational session?
That'd be great, Mayor. Thank you so much. Well, good afternoon, Board of Authority, and thank you for taking time out of your day to meet. I know this is a special meeting. I intend to present a few topics here that I had been hoping to present to the board over the last few months. Obviously, some impacts with the COVID-19 have occurred, and some other action items have kind of taken away from our ability to have enough time to go through these educational sessions. But I believe this is extremely important to be able to provide this information to the board. And so everyone knows this meeting is being recorded. We are going to file this information and make it available to board members in the future if you so choose to go back and refresh on any of the topics that we discuss. And so the intent here is to be an educational session. There will be some Q&A if once we present each individual topic. But this is for your benefit and understanding the P3 relationship and contracting mechanism that we are employing on the diversion project. So, Paul, if you could move forward one slide. So the purpose of what we're doing here today is to present the P3 concepts and ensure that all of the policymakers and board members are aware of the different provisions as we move through the procurement process for the diversion channel portion of the project. And managing a P3 contract is quite a bit different than managing a traditional design build contract or design bid build contract. And so we wanted to take a little bit of time and make sure that we're giving enough information to the board members so you're making the best decisions possible for the taxpayers and the residents of the Fargo-Moorhead metropolitan area. I'd also like to note here, P3 contracts do have and have traditionally shown that if they're not set up properly and maintained properly, there can be dire unintended consequences. So I'm happy to tell you we have one of the foremost experienced P3 procurement teams in the world at our disposal, and that would be Jacobs Engineering. From my perspective as the executive director, I've been extremely pleased at their help, knowledge, and the process so far. So we also want to know what to expect. As we move through the procurement process over the next 9 months, I would like the board to know what the roles are and responsibilities of the public entity as far as proposal evaluation and selection, design and construction phase, and then ultimately the operation and maintenance phase as we move forward. So the goal for these educational sessions is that there's no surprises and that everybody is knowledgeable and can explain exactly what we're doing to any potential constituent that might ask how this contracting arrangement is being administered. Paul, if you can move forward. So I've worked with the P3 procurement team, and we've identified 12 of the most impactful items related to P3 contracting. And as you can see here, we had intended to start this in January. And so this is kind of a catch-up session to get us to where we need to be. And then we'll start dealing with one particular topic during our regular board meetings. So today we'll be talking about the risk transfer, the performance specifications versus prescriptive specifications, and the quality protocol. And Paul, if you move forward. So what is a P3 agreement? I know most of the board members are fairly knowledgeable about this since we've been talking about a P3 agreement for quite some time, and we've gone down the road of procuring a private developer to work in partnership with us in the construction of the diversion comprehensive diversion project. And so P3 is a legally binding contract between a public sector, who in this case is the diversion authority, and the private sector partner, who we refer to as the P3 developer, in which the parties agree to share portions of the risk and rewards. And so this is very different than a traditional contract in that we pay particular attention to where the risk allocation is put, whether it's on the public side or the P3 developer side. And one of the advantages to a P3 contract is that we're really pushing more of the risk than traditional projects onto the P3 developer, and really provides a lot of advantageous points for the public entity. So the diversion channel is being delivered using an availability payment P3 agreement. And I bolded the availability payment because in the P3 world, that is how we provide the revenue stream back to the P3 developer. Other ones would be revenue generating payments, such as a toll road or an airport. And so the two distinctions here are revenue generating payments and availability payments. And we have an availability payment P3. So what you need to know is that this is not the same as managing a traditional design build contract, and the responsibilities for ensuring that the project is constructed and operated and maintained is really on the developer in order to obtain those availability payments in the future. And so what we must do as a public entity is make sure we're contemplating the risk profile and agreeing to proper provisions in the contracting documents with the P3 to protect ourselves and also to ensure that there's the proper oversights and checks and balances being maintained with the P3 developer. So for an example, I laid out here, adding a bridge crossing over the diversion channel after the P3 contract has been awarded changes the terms of what the initial P3 developer has agreed to and would greatly impact the P3 developer's price. So some folks ask, why is it taking so long to go through the P3 procurement process? Well, this is one of the reasons, is that we want to ensure that we're encompassing all elements of the project in the initial P3 contract. Because if we're going to add additional elements after we've already signed the agreement, we lose all negotiating leverage, and items would certainly be a higher cost than if they were included in the original agreement. And move forward one slide, Paul. So here we've kind of showed the roles and the rewards associated with the public entity and the private entity. And so our role as the diversion authority is to select a P3 developer, provide the funding, fulfill the project agreement requirements, and then at the end of the day, we do own the infrastructure and the assets. And the rewards to this arrangement is that we can ensure timely project completion, cost certainty, and increased value for the dollars. So one item with the cost certainty that is a huge benefit to the Diversion Authority project is that once we lock in that P3 contract, we've locked in the price. So it's very different than a traditional project where you run into change orders and unintended construction circumstances that require the contractor to expend more resources. That risk is all on the contractor. And once we get a bid in hand, if we don't add any additional infrastructure after we sign the agreement, that is a cost certain number that we have, and we will not have those change orders. On the private side, obviously, their role is to provide private financing to supplement our public funding, design and construct the project, and operate and maintain the project for 30 years, and then hand back the project in good condition. And the reward for them is a 30-year revenue stream, and that's very predictable, and they can invest capital and do this sort of agreement because it's almost like a 30-year bond back to the investors on the project. So with that, Paul, I'll turn it over to you if you want to address the first topic that we have today.
Okay, sounds good. Let me start that show. And session 2, Kim Daly, I believe, is presenting this one.
Yeah. Thanks, Paul. All right. So session 2, we're going to talk about performance specifications. Session 1 was risk transfer. We heard that in the January board meeting. So now we're moving on to session 2, the performance specifications. Paul, next slide. All right. So we're going to talk about what is a performance specification, and then we're going to compare specification types. Going to talk about why it's important to understand the difference, and then we're just going to shoot out a couple of examples there. We set up these education sessions similar, so everyone's going to look kind of have that same format there. All right, so a performance specification sets a desired outcome, and with a P3 contract, it does that through risk transfer. And again, that's the topic that John Shockley presented at last month's meeting. And if you recall, it's very important to understand risk transfer because it has serious consequences on the cost of the project. So we set up that risk transfer on the technical side through the specifications, the technical requirements, and we do that using 3 different types of specifications, which we'll get into. So in the case of the Fargo-Moorhead Flood Diversion Channel P3 contract, the majority of the technical requirements are performance-based, and that allows the developer to most effectively and efficiently achieve the desired outcome without the diversion authority telling him or her how to conduct the work. Next slide, Paul. All right, so the 3 types of specifications that you'll find are performance specifications, regulatory specifications, and prescriptive specifications. A performance specification, again, makes sure that service delivery is more efficient by allowing the P3 developer flexibility to allow how to best achieve the intended results. All right. And the intended results, the desired outcome. So the developer decides in general what materials to use and how to accomplish the work. The success or failure of the work is a responsibility of the developer because the risk has been transferred to the developer through a performance requirement. All right. So again, performance requirements reflect the parameters that define the outcomes desired by the diversion authority for operational conditions, site impacts, layout quality, whole life costs, instruction approaches. And the PP3 developer has to either meet or exceed those objectives in their proposals and then eventually their work once they're awarded the contract and brought on board. All right, Paul, next slide. All right, so regulatory specification. Regulatory specification is laws, rules, codes, things that have to be adhered to. So there's no getting around these kinds of requirements. They have to be a part of the contract. An example is the environmental stuff, the NEPA approvals. So there are regulatory requirements in the P3 agreement as well. Paul, next slide. And then we also have prescriptive specifications. These are what you see in standard design bid build projects. They tell the developer what materials to use, how to accomplish the work. But the point to remember here is that in using a prescriptive specification, it's then the owner who sets those specifications who is responsible for the success or failure of the work. Right? It's not the developer, it's the owner who retains the risk on these prescriptive specifications. All right, Paul, next slide. All right, so why is it important to understand? So all three types of specifications are used in the P3 agreement. And it's important to know the difference and with whom the risk lies based on the technical requirements of the contract in administering and monitoring the developer's work, right? It'll be a factor in making decisions, measuring the performance of the developer's work, and in implementing the project. Again, it goes back to, or boils down to that risk transfer, what John Shockley was talking about in session 1 and why it's so important to understand that. All right, Paul, next slide. All right, so performance outcomes result in project efficiency, right? Performance specifications focus on what the work is intended to achieve rather than prescribing methods and materials for how to conduct the work, and it transfers the risk. So using performance specifications makes service delivery more efficient by allowing the P3 developer to decide how best to achieve the intended results, right? So with a performance specification, we don't tell them how to do the work. We just tell them what we want as a result, all right? And we'll go through some examples at the end of the presentation, all right? Again, the most important thing to remember is that the performance specs transfer the risk of the performance to the P3 developer. All right, Paul, next slide, please. All right, so regulatory specifications, regulatory outcomes result in project compliance. Again, compliance is the regulatory specifications are compliance with rules, laws, codes, things that we can't avoid. They're required to be in the particular projects. On the prescriptive outcome, again, that results in project certainty, right? And prescriptive requirements result in certainty, whether it's the most efficient, effective approach or not. You'll know exactly what you end up with, right? You'll know what material the work is made out of. You'll know the color, the size, and you'll know how it was performed, right? So it results in certainty, but not necessarily the most effective result. However, there are some areas where you want certainty in your P3 agreement. That's why there are some prescriptive outcomes or prescriptive specifications included in pretty much most P3 contracts. All right, Paul, next slide. All right, so here's some examples. So performance specification is that the specification is that the channel, we're going to ask for a channel that can be whatever height, depth, or shape needed, but it has to pass 46,000 CFS at the inlet. That's a performance specification. A regulatory specification is that all the commitments provided in the environmental permit, the NEPA permit, have to be met. That's regulatory. You have to meet all the commitments within those permits. And then a prescriptive specification is that the channel has to be lined with a specific mix of grasses. We're not going to allow a P3 developer to determine what type of grass is planted along the channel. So it's been prescribed for various reasons. So that is just a really quick overview on performance specifications and then comparing it with other specifications. So if there's any questions, we can go to questions. All right, Paul, I guess we can move on to the next session. All right, Andrew, are you ready?
Yes, thank you, Kim. Next session talks about the quality protocol and how we manage and achieve the required quality outcomes in the project, in the P3 project. Next slide, please, Paul. So what we're going to cover in here is how the quality is ensured through the P3 contract. We'll compare non-conformance and non-compliance with quality requirements. We'll look at why this is important to understand, and we'll have some examples. Now, the quality protocol is a system for ensuring adherence to the regulations, laws, and contract requirements. And that leads to, in default, it leads to triggers for improvement, intervention, or developer default. It's how we measure how that the developer is complying with the requirements of the contract. And to have a quality protocol, we need to be able to define the attributes of it and develop the criteria for establishing the quality, how we oversee and monitor the quality, we audit the quality, and how we report and track the quality. Next slide, please, Paul. So first of all, we need to understand the difference between non-conformances and non-compliance. A non-conformance is a work process or a condition or circumstance that is not in accordance with the project agreement. That is something that has happened either as a result of the developer's actions or by happenstance, particularly during maintenance, where the project is impacted by silting or sloughing or whatever, and that has to be rectified in accordance with the project agreement. And it's a failure to meet a specified standard. Non-compliance, on the other hand, is where there's a failure to comply with the obligations. Non-conformances can be rectified, and they are required to be remedied within a certain time. Non-compliance is where they fail to comply with those obligations. And it may be ongoing obligations of maintenance, or it may be failure to provide things that are very clearly specified that have to be provided. And it's a failure to follow the rules of the contract. Next slide, please, Paul. So non-conformance is a failure to meet a specified standard. Now that is tracked and monitored by the P3 developer. To achieve this, the P3 developer is required to have a fully developed and approved quality management system. And non-conformance, as I said in the last slide, may need to lead to a non-compliance event if it isn't rectified in accordance with the quality management plan. And we achieve the non-conformance. We determine non-conformances by inspections and contract monitoring and audits. Next slide, please, Paul. Non-compliance events are a mechanism to encourage the developer to comply with the contract requirements. And non-compliance events lead to the award of non-compliance points, and they also lead to the award of liquidated damages. They are, in effect, a structured mechanism of liquidated damages and incentives to improve their performance. All the non-compliances are clearly identified in the project agreement. There is a table of them. They're all specific, and they all have specific values of both times for cure and also for actual value of liquidated damages. Non-compliance points, the penalty, non-compliance points rack up to trigger values, and if they achieve those trigger values, then there are certain consequences set out in the project agreement to improve their performance. And that might be that they have to submit an improvement plan, or it can ultimately lead to termination if their performance is sufficiently bad. It hits them in the wallet too, with the liquidated damages associated with it. Non-compliance points all have cure, or most non-compliance points have cure periods, and those cure periods are clearly set out. Next slide, please, Paul. And so, yes, the non-compliance regime incentivizes the developer to meet the requirements. He doesn't want to incur non-compliance points. It costs him money, and also the lenders in a P3 project do not like their developers acquiring non-compliance points, and they get effectively a double whammy. It's a little bit like getting punishment at school, and then when you go home and tell your parents that you got punishment at school, you get punishment at home for having had punishment at school. The same thing happens with the lenders and the developer. Next slide, please, Paul. So why is it important to understand this? It's necessary to understand that this encourages compliance with the project agreement. It also provides a measure of performance on how the developer is actually performing, both in the construction and in the maintenance. It is a yardstick to measure his performance. The better the quality management system that is implemented in a project, the more likely that project will achieve its goals, both on time scale and on money and on the quality of the product which is actually produced. Next slide, please, Paul. And some examples. For non-conformance, the bridge deck has been built an inch thinner than what was shown on the release for construction documents. So the non-conformance is that they built something that wasn't in compliance with their design. Now, that's not to say that it wasn't in accordance with the specifications, because we would probably have asked for a performance specification in respect to that bridge. It is the developer's risk that if the bridge deck is an inch thinner, that bridge deck may not perform to the performance specifications that are in the contract. And if it doesn't perform, then he has to either rebuild it or make improvements and possibly suffer non-compliance penalties and points and liquidated damages. So non-conformance is where they don't do something in accordance with the project, and they have to either remedy it or live with it and live with the consequences. Next slide, please, Paul. A non-compliance event, though, on the other hand, is that they don't do something which is specifically required in the contract. And we have non-compliance events during construction and non-compliance events during operations and maintenance. Some developers don't like, no, all developers don't like non-compliance points. They particularly don't like them during design and construction. However, experience has shown that there is a requirement to have non-compliance points for certain things during construction where non-compliance with the requirement actually impacts the authority and the public and people like that. So for example, they have to provide, before the start of construction, a list of existing roads that may be used as detour routes. If they fail to do that, they have 3 days to cure that non-compliance. If they fail to do that within the 3 days, then they're likely to be awarded 2 non-compliance points. A non-compliance point in the contract is worth about $9,000. So the consequences of not supplying the list of existing roads and having not supplied it when they were supposed to, and still not having done it 3 days from identification, it may cost them $18,000 as a result. And how do we determine that that has happened? We look at the submittal log for the submissions that they're supposed to submit through the electronic ACONX EDMS. And each circumstance where they fail to do that is a separate failure. Next slide, please, Paul. Any questions?
Andrew, I'm going to go ahead and ask the question that I've heard from folks before, and that's the developer is in charge of providing a quality plan. But then they're also going to be out there building the project and monitoring itself. So it seems like it's almost like the fox watching the hen house. How do we make sure that it's built and that's not the case, that there's a quality project being built out there and that the taxpayers' money is being spent wisely?
Could I just confirm, are we having session 4 today of oversight and monitoring?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, well, we touch on that in the next presentation of oversight and monitoring, but it's a point well made. The developer, of course, is the designer and the builder, and also the certifier that the project meets the requirements of the contract documents. The quality management plan is a thorough, or should be a thorough, system that shows how he is going to go through all the monitoring, procurement, oversight, design reviews, construction reviews, how the paperwork gets to the site, how they ensure that the paperwork that gets to the site is actually read and it's constructed correctly. It is an ISO 9000 style quality management plan. In fact, it has to be an ISO 9000 compliant quality management plan. That's not to say it has to be certified as ISO 9000, but it does have to be to ISO 9000 standards. And that is an internationally recognized method of developing a quality management plan. Compliance with that quality management plan has to be audited by the developer, but it's also audited by ourselves, and we will have a quality audit team to audit the quality management plan. We will be monitoring their compliance with their oversight requirements. So they are entirely responsible for oversight, quality assurance, and we monitor that through strategic quality audit system. We will also be carrying out compliance checking on site of both random and ad hoc inspections. These will be recorded in an electronic database, and that will form the basis for monitoring any defects, any deficiencies, and will ultimately form the basis for achieving substantial completion and giving the authority confidence that the project has been constructed in accordance with the release for construction documents. Does that help answer the question? It's all gone very quiet.
I think we can move on to the next session.
Okay. There we go. So the fourth session deals with oversight and monitoring, just really taking on from answering that last question there. Next slide, please, Paul. So on this, we're going to look at what is oversight and monitoring, how is monitoring accomplished, why is it important to understand, and we'll also provide you some examples. So both the Diversion Authority and the P3 developer play a role in managing the project performance standards. Well, it's not just the performance standards, it's managing all the project requirements that are set out in the project agreement and the technical requirements. And also, in the case of the developer, complying with regulatory requirements, and in the case of the Diversion Authority, ensuring that regulatory requirements are met. Now, oversight is the action of overseeing something. It's careful and vigilant supervision, and it's for work or product for which the entity doing the oversight is responsible. Whereas monitoring on the part of the Diversion Authority is ensuring that the oversight is actually happening. That may sound like double counting or double duty, if you like, but it is just giving the Diversion Authority the confidence that the developer is carrying out the full oversight of the work that it's carrying out. Oversight is 100%, monitoring is sample observation. Next slide please, Paul. So the Diversion Authority will monitor the P3 developer's activity during the design, construction and maintenance phases of the project to ensure that all standards in the project agreement are achieved. The P3 developer oversees their own activities during the entire term of the project agreement. And the object of that is to avoid non-conformances and to remedy non-conformances and to avoid non-compliance events and therefore avoid liquidated damages. Next slide, please, Paul. So the Diversion Authority conducts reviews, inspections and audits of all the aspects of the P3 developer's work. And so each year, the Diversion Authority or whoever is doing the monitoring will develop an audit plan for the year, and they will determine which areas of the project need to be audited and when they will carry out these audits. Now, those are not exhaustive, and if the Diversion Authority feels that additional audit is required, they're perfectly at liberty to do that, and that's both on-site and off-site at manufacturing plants or material producing plants. The project agreement allows that we can do that. The Diversion Authority will also carry out, as I said, inspections, and those inspections are random and ad hoc, and all of that is recorded on an online tracking system. And so it will look at completed works, the inspections. There will be confirmation that the as-built drawings reflect the constructed work. The Diversion Authority also reviewed design changes. We'll keep an eye on environmental activities and in particular environmental infractions. And the Diversion Authority will also review progress reports, schedules, and so on. And as I said, by using audit as well. And that ensures that there's compliance with the laws, the technical requirements, the plans, the designs, and that ensures that the work can be certified as complete or substantially complete, and also creates the punch list of minor defects that need to be required post substantial completion. Next slide, please, Paul. The reason that we have the distinction between oversight and monitoring, oversight gives the risk to the overseer to ensure that compliance is happening on site. Monitoring is just that. It is giving confidence that the correct oversight is being carried out. It's a risk thing. If the Diversion Authority took over the oversight of the developer in the construction, they would essentially take back a significant risk to the Diversion Authority for the performance of the project. And we don't want oversight to impact on the efficiencies that the developer is able to bring through the design build approach to the P3 project. Next slide, please, Paul. So how is monitoring accomplished? The P3 developer follows the procedures established in their Diversion Authority approved construction management system and compliance checking program. The construction management system, well, I'll call it the quality management system, because the quality management system is made up of several plans: the design quality management plan, the construction quality management plan, and the operations and maintenance quality management plan. And the reason for having those separate plans is because they are developed at different stages in the project. It is a requirement of Notice to Proceed 1 to start design that they have an approved design quality management plan in place. Because that is the document that they're going to be working to during design. Likewise, for NTP2, Notice to Proceed with Construction, that they must have an approved construction quality management system in place, quality management plan in place, sorry, and so on through the phases of the project. And the plans, they don't just outline the procedures, they specifically call out in great detail the procedures for verification of compliance with the design, construction, maintenance, submittals, schedules, and commitments. And so they are a plan which contains processes and procedures, processes being the mechanisms by which things are going to be carried out, and the procedures being the methods by which they are actually carried out and how they are recorded, measured, by whom, and where they're recorded, and so on and so forth. Next slide, please. So why is this important to understand? It's important to ensure that the project is delivered and complies with the performance requirements in the project agreement. And it's important to do that without reclaiming the transferred risks or impinging on efficiencies. It is the developer's project to build and get right. The Diversion Authority just wants the confidence of the developer's innovation and freedom, if you like, to determine how it carries out its own work. The importance of having the quality management plan and the importance of having it developed properly and approved, and it is a hold point and it's a discretionary hold point, is that you only ever get what you pay for. If there is often a temptation, or it's often the case when quality management plans are required, that they get developed in a kind of, they'll never look at this way, and they get stuck on the top shelf in the site office and not even taken down for dusting off occasionally. That will not be the case on a P3 project, and certainly not on this P3 project. That is an active document. It gets reviewed. It gets reviewed regularly. If it's found not to be working, or if there are parts that are deficient in practice, those have to be rectified and amended. Next slide, please. So an example, the requirement is to construct a channel to mitigate flooding. Now we transfer that risk to the P3 developer. And the performance requirement is that it must convey 46,000 CFS of water, or accept 46,000 CFS of water at the diversion inlet structure and convey it for 30 odd miles. They have to design that project. They can design it however they want, meeting the parameters of the contract documents. They have to design it in accordance with their quality management plan, and that goes through the various reviews and ensures that the various disciplines that are to be involved in it are involved in it, and it's all signed off. It is then handed out to the site in a controlled way, and the design is then constructed in a regulated manner. And the way we measure that the diversion channel is compliant with those requirements and that we're getting the quality required is that we use the H&H model, the HEC-RAS model, to determine that the design will work. And then once it's constructed, we will apply the as-built constructed works to the model to verify that it still is in compliance. And the monitoring will be carried out to ensure that the various parts of the construction were carried out in accordance with the specification. For example, further example, if you like, there are things which you might not see if you weren't there during construction. You might not see that the diversion channel line of protection was compacted in accordance with the specifications that are prescriptive specifications actually in the design of in the requirements for the design of the levee. And so we will go and look at the records to ensure that they've been following their own processes. We will have already established that those processes are sufficient, and we will monitor on site, not every 100% of that levee. We will go and monitor in various places physically to ensure that they're doing what their paperwork says they're doing when we go back to their site office and look at their records. I think, is that the last slide, Paul? Yes. So any questions from that?
Thanks, Andrew. So I just have a quick question, and I think it will, your answer will kind of explain in a scenario case what the difference is between oversight and monitoring. So say during construction, Commissioner Peterson receives a phone call from a constituent complaining about noise. What ability do we have then to be able to go to the project site and demand that the contractor reduce their noise level? And how are we dealing with that now during the procurement to ensure that we have an appropriate level of regulatory enforcement on something like that?
So there are two aspects to, for example, noise. There are regulatory requirements in respect of noise, and the developer is required to comply with any regulatory requirements in respect of noise. But also we have some, and they really are performance specifications that require that no work be carried out in certain areas at certain times within certain distances of certain properties. And so we've been mindful to the impact of 24-hour working, for example, on adjacent properties, in particular in adjacent dwelling houses. So what we will do with that is that we will have to go to the developer and say, look, we've had a complaint about this. Are you working within the parameters of the project agreement? And they should have records. And if they don't have records that show when they were working, what times they were working, and where they were working, I'm not suggesting that they need to carry decibel meters about with them. But what we do attempt to do with a situation like that is we have tried to be proactive and identify those areas that are likely to be of concern during the construction of the project. And so we put in addition to the regulatory requirements, we put in specific requirements that they have to abide by. They are we do try to have performance requirements rather than specific requirements. And so I believe that the specifications we have in there for noise meet those requirements at the moment.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. And so the point I'm trying to make here is a lot of the work to ensure that these sorts of things are taken care of are being done currently right now during the procurement phase. And so it's going to be different than a traditional project where we have a little bit more control over the contractor's operation and the construction site. So of course, it's of utmost concern that we address these issues effectively in the request for proposal documents and that they're being taken care of now. And so with that, I'll open it up if there's any questions from the board on any of the content that we've gone over today.
Well, Joel, sounds like the team's got it. It was a good presentation. Is there any other comments? Other than that, we're gonna have a meeting on April 23rd, similar to this video. Joel?
The April 23rd meeting will be a regular board meeting, Tim. So we will address another topic at that meeting as well. This meeting was intended to catch us up to where we were on our proposed schedule. And so the next meeting, we'll have a educational session, but we'll also take care of our regular business as well.
What I'm suggesting is the COVID virus is starting to spike in the Fargo-Moorhead area. We should want to do this video as well. So.
Oh, that's correct, Mayor Mahoney. We are anticipating a virtual meeting next week.
Any other business of the board that anybody wants to address this time? Otherwise, we'll be adjourned. Very good. Adjourned.
All right.
Thank you.